Be very, very careful when you're using return on equity as a gauge for analyzing stocks. All right, I'm telling you right now, it's an easy trap to fall into. I'm going to show you why it's scary. So, as everything, you need to break this down to how it would relate to just you, Joe, and Jane Schmo out there in friggin' Topeka, Kansas. If we can break that down, you'll see how it relates to the big Wall Street conglomerates, the globalists and all that, and how they can easily manipulate the data to make it seem like it's a stock that you'd want to buy. So let's go into this. All right, so return on equity, ROE, is a big way you can analyze a stock. Obviously, the higher the return on equity, the better the value would be, right? Or the more potential growth. So let's talk about this simplicity. Simplistically, we're going to take a $100,000 mortgage, and we'll say this is Jane, and we're going to take Joe with a $100,000 mortgage. All right? Jane puts 20% down payment. That means she has $80,000 of leverage, of debt. Leverage and debt's the same thing, and $20,000 of equity. All right? So Jane's got $80,000 of debt, $20,000 of equity. If we have a 3% increase, yeah, you can see that, in the value of the home, this now goes up to what? Well, actually, let's go over here real quick. I'll change this around a little bit to make it easier, and then we'll go back to Joe. So Jane has a 3% increase in the value of her home. So this will go up to $103,000. All right, so 3% increase goes up to $103,000. So she made $3,000 on $20,000, $3,000 on $20,000 of equity. So her ROE equals, take my trusty calculator, is what? So 3,000 divided by 20, 15%. And generally 15% is a nice number you're shooting for on ROE. All right, so she has a 15% ROE. Now another way to look at it is ROA, return on assets. All right, so the asset is $100,000. She made $3,000 on the 100, so she has $3,000 divided by the asset base. So she has a 3% ROA, and that's typically the way it be. The ROA will usually be significantly lower than the ROE, and you got to keep that in mind. All right, so that makes sense. Now, at the end of the day, is that good, bad, or otherwise? Well, she still owes $80,000. All right, so that's just a fact. But now instead of having $20,000 of equity, she has $23,000 of equity because the leverage gave her all that growth, and the debt is still fixed. All right, so let's go on to part 2 of this now. So that's Jane. So what we're going to do is we're going to write ROE for Jane, 15%, ROA, 3%. All right, now let's go to Joe. All right, so Joe, on the other hand, he's going to have a higher ROE because he is heavily leveraged, much more heavily leveraged than Jane. And we'll show you how that. Actually, I probably should do this with my right hand. Be good for my. Ooh, yeah, that hurts a little bit, but it's a good pain there. Be good for my my physical therapy. Old Rachel, my physical therapist, makes me hurt. All right, so here's Jane. You see that? Yeah. All right, cool. Now here's old Joe. And we'll use green here. So Joe's got $100,000, but he only puts $5,000 down as his down payment. So he has $95,000 of debt. It's not very dry. You can see that. All right, let me get a black. Where's this brown? $95,000 of down payment. $95,000 of debt and $5,000 of equity. All right, so debt, equity. All right, same thing happens with old Joe. Excuse me, buddy. Excuse me, Popskis, Pablo. Excuse me. So now we got a $3,000 increase. So now this goes up 3%. and we got $103,000 is the house value. All right, so the house went up by 3%. But now his ROE equals 3,000 divided by 5,000. What's that going to be? 60%, right? Yeah, it'll be 60. Well, just make sure so I don't look like a fool. Yeah, 60%. So his ROE, 60%. What's his ROA? Anyone want to take a guess? It's still 3%. Which is a better position to be in? Joe has ROE of 60% and ROA of 3. So you can quickly see who's got more debt by just looking at the return on assets versus return on equity. You can quickly see that. In this case, Joe has got 4 times the ROE as Jane, simply because he has 4 times the amount of debt. Well, not 4 times, but Jane had 4 times the amount of equity is what it would be. So in this case, Jane has 4 times the equity, and so she has 1/4 of the ROE of Joe, because ROE is based on how much equity you put in, and Joe didn't put that much in. So in a highly, how can we say this without scaring off people? In a growing, I hate to say the word bubble, but in a percolating asset growth, ROE will always be higher for the people that are most heavily leveraged. Does that make sense? So if you're looking at ROE and you're just looking at it based solely on that metrics, and you're not looking at ROA or on debt, you're going to make a huge mistake, because you can have a huge ROE by just taking tons of debt. Don't do that. Now, look, is that bad or good? Well, I will tell you, I was looking at a company, man, about a year or so ago for a sister actually, and they had an ROE that was quite good, and they had a debt or a dividend that was quite good. And we're looking at the cash flow. I was like, where's that cash flow come from? Because their cash flow was declining each and every year. All right, so they were making less and less money each and every year from business operations. And so I said, okay, so you can see their ROE was extraordinarily high. You could see, I didn't even look at ROA because I could see this a mile away what was happening. Their debt was growing each and every year, and their dividend they were trying to prop up by borrowing in order to pay the dividend. Now that actually makes sense. To borrow to pay a dividend in some ways doesn't all that concern me that much. I'll tell you why this did. It's simply because the dividend is double tax. All right, dividends, the business pays tax on the dividend when they earn the money as a profit, and then the consumer pays, the shareholder pays tax on the dividend as well. So businesses are taxed twice. They don't get a write-off on the dividend payout. They got to pay tax on the profit in which to pay the dividend, which is why people go into debt on the business side, because the debt is tax deductible. All right, so if you own a business and you have debt, you can write off the interest of the debt. You cannot write off the dividend that you pay to your shareholders. You actually, if it's a profitable enterprise, you actually have to pay taxes on the profits that you receive in which to pay the dividend. So it gives you a lot of thoughts on, hey, how do you manage debt versus how do you manage dividend payout? In this case, you can say, look, we'll take on the debt in order to pay the dividend, and you're thinking, well, that's not a bad deal, except these guys were not making money. They're losing money, all right? So you could see their debt was growing, the cash flow was shrinking, and their ROA was pretty high. ROE was high relative to what their peers were, and that was because their debt load was growing and growing and growing. And as long as the assets that they owned, which they're heavily leveraged, continue to grow, their ROE looked good. But their ROA, again, is just the same as everybody else, because the asset is the same across the board. So if you have a similar ROA and one has an ROE significantly higher than another, we know why. It's because they're taking on tons and tons of leverage for sure. Keep that in the back of your mind. So in this case, I said she needed to sell the stock simply because there's no way they're going to maintain that dividend. I mean, they could do it for a while. As long as there's people willing to lend, there'll always be an opportunity for a company to lend and say, oh, we're getting back on track. Yay, we're getting back on track. We're the CEO, the CIO, and the CMO, and the CBO, and the CBD, and CCR, and the whole thing. We're getting back on track. Just hang with us, shareholders, and we're still paying you a fat dividend. Still only taxed at 15%. Qualified dividend. It's all good. And yet they're piling on debt over debt over debt. It's not what we want to see. We want to see, in my opinion, because when the assets take a turn for the worse and you're heavily leveraged, what happens? Well, we've seen this 1,000 million times a Sunday. Loans get called, and if you don't have cash on the side, and if you have heavily borrowed more and more and more, you're going to have to pay a significant cost for that. And I'm telling you, man, we just seen it in the Great Depression. We've seen it in the Japanese recession. We've seen it in 2008 when the band stops playing. The people who own the most debt are in a world of hurt. Do not judge a stock just on ROE alone. Watch their debt levels, all right? Especially if they're paying a dividend. If they have a high price to earnings ratio or even a negative price to earnings ratio, which would be they're not profitable. I'm telling you, man, that's a scary proposition to be. Which is again why I like value stocks. Value stocks, they have a low PE ratio, a low price to book, and they have a high dividend yield, relatively speaking. That does not mean they're cash flow positive. I'm telling you right now, but usually it does, because their cash flow is why they have a low price to their earnings. They're still making money relative to the price per share, which is exactly what you want to see, in my opinion. Just remember, ROE. Don't get suckered into thinking ROE is good. ROA is a better metric because it assumes, or doesn't assume, it just says what is the return on the entire asset, not just on the leveraged amount. How would you, and then you got to can you look at it in terms of just pure return on I guess you'd say return on total assets, which would be cash. That's absolutely a good way to look at it, because if you have no debt and you have nothing but cash, then your ROA, return on assets, will be significant better way to understand the corporation, how it's managing its growth. All right, so if you have an ROA and no debt, a good ROA relative to your peers and no debt, that means you're managing that business very, very profitably. You're returning a good from your total asset base, which includes your cash, includes your buildings, the whole thing, your intellectual property. If you're able to generate positive cash flow and good returns to your shareholders with no debt and have a good ROA relative to your peers, that's a good place to be. You can certainly have a good ROE like our man Joe did here, but man, at some point that day is going to stop when the bubble breaks, and when it does, you're doomed. So keep that in mind. All right, I'll see you next time.